Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Elephant. I'm your host, Julian, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Anthony. Anthony, how you doing? Great, great. So today we want to kick off a conversation about Donald Trump's most fervent and loyal voting base, white people. And as two people that live in an undisclosed location that has many white people in it, I think that even though neither of us are genetically white, we feel that it's something that we can bring perspective. I'm really excited about this conversation because
Yeah.
there's a lot to
So
unpack
yeah.
with this incredibly large group of
Julian, let me
who are.
ask you. I'm not going to ask you where
Mhm.
you grew up, but I will ask you, growing up, what was your? And I think they're going to be different, you and ours,
For
because
sure.
what was your experience of white? How were you introduced to whiteness? Was it? I mean, did you have a friend from school? Did your parents have a conversation? How did you stumble upon this concept that some people were white?
Yeah, I think for some people it sets later than others. I fully remember being sort of maybe like 5 or 6 before I really thought about like whiteness as anything other than cosmetic, right? Like anything other than like having curly hair or straight hair or green eyes, or like that's not something that we really
Mm,
keep track of in
mm,
America. And I didn't think of it as anything different than that maybe till after I was maybe 6 years old. And, I would say it was around the time that my family, we had moved to a different part of town, and we had like this neighbor who had kids that are basically age, around my age. And my next door neighbor was like this white kid. And that was the first time I kind of realized, oh, okay, this is what actually like an American white family looks like. And it's somewhat
mm,
different than my
mm.
black family. And there were just many things to unpack there. Yeah.
Yeah,
How about you?
yeah. Well, I was an immigrant child, and white people, and I grew up in an area where immigrants were beginning to arrive, but it was still a suburb of a major American city, and it was predominantly white. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and there was some black families as well, but for some reason, the white kids and their families, they seem to be America to us, right? They were the
Mm-hmm.
insiders. And it's not that black kids weren't, it's just we had learned a bit about, history and about how white people were brought here, right? And so there was sort of it's like, okay, we also were brought here, sort of, but white people, at least at the time, like, well, they're the ones that, we're told is their country, right?
Yeah.
And so that's how we sort of saw them. And my parents, well, at least my mom at the time, got a job as a nanny to a white family, and we would go to their houses, and very different from our apartments, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they just seemed different in every single way: how they went to church, what they ate, the language they spoke, right? They
Mm-hmm.
seemed to just have a larger head start than we did. And then after a while, when I got a little older, it was this idea of, oh, oh, white kids can't be as proud to be white as maybe I'm allowed to be proud to be Mexican, or my black friends are proud to be black. They have to watch it a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And they
Yeah.
have to demonstrate. They have to do it in a different way. And but yeah, so there was definitely a a moment where white people were America. That's what America
Mm-hmm.
was. And if you weren't white, you could maybe be an American on paper, but not really.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
It was still sort of their country. I don't think that anymore.
Right. Right.
And I think that is sort of indicative of why we're here.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
little
That's
bit.
very
Right?
much why we're here.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Is like they're the default
Yeah.
setting. Right.
Right. Exactly.
And
And yeah.
we all kind of subconsciously know that.
And in Spanish, you don't call them white people.
Mm,
You call them Americans,
mm,
right? Or gringos if you're trying to be derogatory. But not
right.
really. That's not really a derogatory word. It's just, but no, they were the default people, right?
Right.
American people. And then slowly, because of, we learned about civil rights and, oh, okay, there's America's a pluralistic society, right? Where there's many different types of people. And now, you know, their existence in America, I think, warrants discussion, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the way they've behaved in the last 20 years has been
Yeah.
fascinating, to say the least.
I think that it's hard to have honest conversations about white people. And it kind of has frustrated me, which is one of the reasons why I want to have it here. Because, first of all, starting with the term white people, as soon as you start talking about white people,
Right,
white people don't want to talk about white people. Like,
right,
as soon as, if you're like a white conservative,
right.
if a group of like people of color, if two people of color like you and me are like talking about white people, they're like, okay, here we go. All right, I know what's happening
Here
next. Like,
comes the gripe fest.
yeah, here
Yes,
comes the grab,
yes.
here comes the firing
Mm,
squad.
mm,
Just let's get it
mm,
over with, right? And
mm.
then if you talk about white people with like a white liberal, then it's like, oh, yeah, I get you, man. Like
Oh, it's the self. What is it called?
flagellation. Yeah, it's like the
Self-flagellation comes.
self-flagellation.
Oh yes.
Yeah. And the
Oh
thing is,
yes.
there's so many different types of white
Hmm.
people.
Totally.
Right. Like they're the largest group of ethnic group in our country. And so there's no like you say white people and that tells you almost nothing about like who you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a
Right.
white person that lives in Seattle, and then there's a white person that lives in Nebraska, and they are not the same.
Yeah.
They're not the
They're
same.
totally different
Yeah.
people. And so, but there are these shared, you know,
Mm.
characteristics that white people have, especially when we're talking about politics. And I think that that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to not talk about white people and use that term because it's
Mm.
sort of necessary to identify the group. But at the same time, you set yourself up for this, emotional, defensive, knee jerk reaction to the discussion anytime you're actually talking with white people about white people. And so, you know, the that being said, we're going to do this. So the first thing, obviously, that I want to get into is like, if any group is in part responsible for the election of Donald Trump, it is white people. And I don't
Mm.
say that to be accusatory. That's just a fact. Right. And, I think it's like 57 to 60% of white people in the last election voted for
Yeah,
Donald Trump.
around 57%. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and this has been pretty consistent for like in both times he was elected and each election. And what I think, and I said this in our first episode, that much like our conversation, our last episode with men, I think that there are concerns that white people have that nobody talks about.
Oh, and also 60% of white men.
60% of white men.
Mhm. And 53% of white women. So he definitely won both genders, but
Yes,
white men by so much more. Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that, like, to me, white conservatives uh, gravitated towards Trump for, people like to intellectualize why white people like Trump, why Trump voters like Trump. They want to give you all of these stories about the economy and his appeal to the working class and, this, that, and the other. And it's not that those things aren't true. I just think that there's one thing that sets Donald Trump up that is very different from every other Republican politician, right? Like, if you wanted the best economic candidate for Donald Trump, would not be the person you'd gravitate towards first,
Mm,
right?
hmm.
You would want someone like Mitt Romney, who's like
Right.
a more legitimate businessman,
Right.
right? But Donald Trump, I think, succeeds where Mitt Romney fails because of his direct appeals to whiteness. And this starts with even before he runs for office, with starting the birther lie, right? Where he's
Hmm.
talking about Obama not being an actual US citizen. That puts him on the map. And then he follows it up.
I don't think Mitt Romney had any desire to be the backlash.
Right.
And Donald Trump was all for that. He was the backlash.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was the spark of the backlash. And I mean, look, and I'm not trying to position Donald Trump as some sort of genius who's like a sociopolitical sort of mastermind. I don't think he's that.
Right.
But I think what he does have is like raw instincts of
Mm-hmm.
where power will be. And I think he was feeling, I mean, I think it was fairly obvious if you weren't on the coast that, you know, Barack Obama, the election of Barack Obama caused a lot of white anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And it really was, I mean, look at the Tea Party, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, or even going back from the Tea Party to Newt Gingrich versus Clinton, at least Clinton was white, right?
Yeah.
Because, yeah, I mean, a lot of people said that Bill Clinton was the first black president, right? Because he was
Right.
a Southern white. Um, and yeah, the backlash just, I mean, if you imagine this as a catapult, it just gets pulled back more,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And all you need is someone to sort of light the spark and enter Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
And so, what about him do you think is so sort of tailor made to appeal kind of a large white demographic? I mean, he didn't just win, you know, the 40% of the GOP electorate that will always be with him, right?
Right.
That is, I mean, he didn't just win that. He won blue collar. He won. I mean, 60% of white men. That is a lot. That's more than just farmers in Peoria, right? That's Wall Street people. That's Florida people, right? That's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people. So, what do you think about the white experience? What is it about the white experience? I know I'm asking you this, but what
Yeah.
is it about the white experience that sort of that Donald Trump sort of encapsulates or sort of acts as a good, you know, mirror for or an ink block test or something like that? Do you
Yeah.
think that Donald Trump is sort of that for the Barack Obama of white people?
And I think actually one of the reasons I don't feel apprehension about speaking on behalf of white people in this way is that I
Yeah.
feel like white people cannot say what I am going to say,
Mm, mm, mm,
especially the ones that are my friends. They will
hmm.
not tell me this.
Sure.
And I think that Donald Trump, you mentioned his instincts, his superpower is that he is rich enough and
Mm.
insulated enough that he can just say what other white people are thinking without suffering
True.
repercussions, right?
True.
And I think that that's really what it is. I don't think that he like mastermind plots
Yeah.
out that like this much of the electorate will be with me.
And
I
it's
think
not like
he
he's
just,
likable.
yeah,
It's
I
not like
think
he's
he,
likable. It's just he just gets away with it.
yeah, he
Yeah.
knows that at the end of the day, he's going to enter this race and he's going to say what's on his mind and it'll be cathartic for him. And at the, he'll still be rich by the end of the week. Right. And
Hmm.
so he gets in the race and he says, like, you know what? The problem with this country is all of the immigrants coming in. And the
Hmm.
immigrants is the nice way of saying like the brown people, right?
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
it is very much about race.
Yeah.
And he says these things time and again. He talks about how we have all of these people coming from, bad countries like
Hmm.
Africa,
Hmm.
African countries coming. Why don't we get
Hmm.
some people coming in from
Right. Good
Norway
countries.
or
Yes,
and
yes.
Europe, and you're like, that's clearly racial,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
have the Muslim ban, which is clearly racially inspired, right?
So are you saying that? I mean, you're obviously saying Donald Trump is a racist, which I think I don't think that's brave. I think that's obvious, right?
right.
But then connecting that now to why is that so appealing then to
Yes,
white
and
America?
absolutely, because I think that what white America and really all America struggles to admit is that we as human beings fear the other
Mm,
very, very much. When I took political psychology classes back when I was in college, we talked a lot about us versus them narratives
hmm.
and in group, out group dynamics, and how, from a psychological perspective, you can just tell a random sample of people that people with black hair are better than people with blonde hair, and you can poll those people the next day and they'll be like, I like people with black hair more than people with blonde hair, right? Literally just that. And there's all sorts of
Mm,
psychological studies with kids in classrooms and adults
sure.
where just highlighting some sort of otherism within the groups causes in-group out-group dynamics to form. This is a human conception. But in America, we have had over 400 years of an in group, out group dynamic narrative formed around white people
Yeah.
and other racial groups. And that has not gone away just because we elected Barack Obama, right?
Mm,
Even though
mm,
I think that for many white people, that's what they hoped would happen
yeah.
was that we would
Yeah.
elect him and it would give us the only thing we want more than a white president, which is absolution,
Hmm.
right? We can
Hmm.
kind of move past this conversation. And for me, it seems sort of evident when you look at polls that say 30% Americans believe that Obama was not born in America, 50% of conservatives are deeply troubled by the idea that the birth of minority children is outpacing that of
Right.
white children, which
Hmm.
happened in 2010, right? So the idea that the great replacement
The
theory, as it's
replacement theory.
called,
Yeah.
is happening. And I don't think, I think this is one of the places where Democrats get like lost in the woods is that they call it like this theory and like this conspiracy. And there are parts of it that are a conspiracy, that it's like this master plan by elites to change the electorate. It's just demographic change. Like it's just like naturally what happens.
Well, it's demographics and it's socioeconomics, right?
Yeah.
I do. Yeah. Hmm.
But I think it terrifies the hell out of white people of all political stripes. I think it doesn't matter whether you're liberal or conservative. The idea that white people are not going to be the majority is concerning. And I'm not really surprised by that.
Mm.
I'm I'd mention that if you think of the neighborhood you live in and you told me that next week the demographics were going to change
Oh
entirely,
yeah.
anybody would be concerned. Now this is a much slower
Hmm.
progression, but I think it starts at this core human in-group out-group dynamic and then it expands into these narratives around white replacement and otherism and immigration and who's coming to this country and who's not.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, the fact that he is now, in his second term, deporting, children that were born in the United States.
American
Um,
citizens.
yeah. Yeah. He's deported three children, 7, 4, and 2. And I mean, does white anxiety? Um,
I think that definitely for his voters,
mhm,
it does. And I don't think they would want to admit that like it's this
mhm,
kind of deep seated, and I don't blame it. Like
mhm,
we talk a lot in in race about like things like implicit bias. Like I don't necessarily think this was a conscious thing that every Trump voter is aware of. I think that the permission structures constructed around it sound like, well, these people are costing the economy,
Right.
right? Or these people are a burden on our healthcare system. And these are how we convince ourselves that this is the logical,
Hmm.
sort of hard nosed economic approach to the very human fear of being replaced.
Right. But I mean, this is the richest country in the world, and we still approach it as a scarcity sort of mentality, right? And
Mm-hmm.
also this idea of, it's fine if the government, provides me with assistance when I'm doing, if I'm a vet or something and I need health care. But yeah, I'll be damned if my tax dollars are used to help families that aren't white, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah.
Have you,
Mhm. What?
I was going to say, have you heard there's this woman, Heather McGee,
Hmm.
who has this book called The Sum of Us, who I've read a
Hmm.
good portion of, and she has this story about swimming pools in America. I don't know if
Hmm.
you're familiar with the swimming pool
I,
story.
not the story, but yeah, go on.
You're probably familiar, but it kind of tells the story how after FDR put all this money into creating the suburbs, and you had white flight where white people move out of the cities
Sure.
and they go into these suburbs, and the suburbs were like this great place and they would provide all these luxury goods to suburbia, and swimming pools were like this big luxury good that they thought they could provide to suburbs in mass. And so you had all
Hmm.
these giant swimming pools pop up all over the country in this sort of like post-war era. That was great until desegregation. And
Hmm.
then you start to have black people move
Right.
into these suburbs as
Right.
well. And because these were public swimming pools, by all rights, they had access to them. And
Hmm.
there were lots of fights about keeping black people out of these pools, but eventually the law won out and they had to let
Hmm.
them into the pools. So
Right.
what most of these cities did is they filled up the swimming pools, right?
Mm.
They didn't
Right.
figure out a way for us all to have swimming pools. They just said we would rather go and have swimming pools than for black people to
Wow.
swim in the swimming pools.
Okay.
And
Well. Okay. Okay. Well,
mhm,
let's focus in on that. Okay.
yeah,
So hate, right? So
mhm,
being motivated by hate is irrational, right? For example, I thought what you were going to say after the swimming pool was like, oh, guess what? They built country clubs, right? But then, which they did,
mhm,
and but then they excluded Jews from country clubs, which
mhm,
for
mhm.
me, anti-Semitism has always fascinated me
Yeah,
as to why a white person can hate another white person. You
yeah,
know, like I get it. Like I'm from Mexico, and sure, like we look at Brazilians, sideways, but like we don't hate them. Like
mhm,
we're
mhm,
still Latinos, but yeah, there is an idea of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? And how they've just drawn a tight circle around what is white, which is why I wanted to start this conversation of what is white, right? Because yeah, the white people I observed growing up were, suburban. I grew up in California suburbanites, right? That's who they were. I don't think I made a distinction if they were Jewish or not, but there were
mhm,
Jewish people where I grew up. And but I don't know if white people would consider Jewish people white until recently, right? And then
mhm,
very
mhm.
recently how that's becoming a whole thing, right? But yeah, like yeah, a Brooklyn Jewish person is a white person, but not going to be probably not going to be voting for Donald Trump. Probably there are some Jewish people in Miami that would probably maybe I don't know, but and Jewish people are not a monolith either, right? But the fact that even they are feeling some backlash now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just find that supremely interesting. That the hate or the prejudice, um, it really isn't just directed at immigrants or African Americans, but even people that, or even the elite, right? Whatever the elite is, other white people that are in the elite, you know, which is something
Mm-hmm.
that's very popular, which is why I think Jewish people get sort of, you know,
Yeah. And
co-opted in that.
I think that's one of the interesting things we're seeing coming out of this election. You mentioned how whiteness is kind of hard to define and uh, there's certain groups of white people like Jews who are white but also like not. And I think
Right.
it's that's one of the reasons that I think being white kind of sucks.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Right? And really we're not this like people of color are not supposed to admit this. Like we're really not supposed to talk about like why
No.
being white sometimes really does kind of suck. Right? We're
Well,
only supposed to talk about
because
like all the advantages they have and so
yeah,
there are many and I'm not going
sure,
to I can give
there
tons of
are.
disclaimers about
There are many.
the socioeconomic advantages in
Yes.
the workplace and whatever about white. Okay, let's table that for another comment section. But here's why being white kind of sucks, right? Is that
Okay.
in the
Yes.
beginning, there was no such thing as white, right? White
Mm.
is was not like an ethnicity. Nobody came to America and was like, "Oh, look, I'm white."
Right.
Right?
Right.
Because everyone was white
Mm.
of some different shade, right?
Mm.
You had
Okay.
people from Western Europe and Eastern Europe and Southern, like all these different types of Europeans were coming to America.
But
And
there were still some distinctions, right? There was
there were
still
some
like
distinctions, but it wasn't
of
about,
class. Yeah.
there was distinctions about class. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And those distinctions were very important,
Yeah.
right? How America was originally divided up is, as you said, there's these white Anglo-Saxon Protestants at the
Mhm.
top.
Right.
And then you had Catholics
Hmm.
and you had Italians and you had
Mm.
Irish and you
Right.
had Jews.
It was actually, yeah,
And
it was, religion was huge, right? Because Irish
Mhm,
and Italians were both Catholics.
exactly, exactly. And that's why
And
we
so
have
they were
Columbus Day.
white, but a little asterisk because you're not Protestant.
Exactly. In fact,
Yeah.
Columbus Day, for those that don't
Mm-hmm.
know, was created
Mm-hmm.
because the Catholics, who
Mm-hmm.
were an oppressed group at the time, were like, we
Mm-hmm.
need a day like MLK Day now to
Sure.
recognize our
Right.
importance to the country. And so they held up
Right.
Christopher Columbus as their kind of
Sure.
minority hero.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Cristoforo Colombo.
how
Yes.
history has changed the
Yes.
interpretation of Christopher Columbus.
Oh
Anyway,
yes. And then they just removed him. They were like, nope. And by they I mean Barack.
welcome to Obama's America.
You can see why they're mad.
Yeah, to me, whiteness was just not a thing for
Mm.
many, many years in our country's
Yeah.
history.
No, I think you're right.
And then here's where the rub is that you have all of these Latinos coming, you have all of these Chinese and Japanese Americans, and of course, black people. And oh my gosh, the Anglo Saxon Protestants are actually starting to get outnumbered
Mm.
when you mix the lower income
Mm.
Irish and the lower income Italians with the lower income blacks and Latinos
I
and
mean,
Chinese.
yeah, and then intermarriages became legal in like 1975,
Hmm.
because that was illegal in a lot of states,
Hmm.
especially southern states.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And all of a sudden you have this huge problem that
yeah.
like, oh my gosh, we're going to be replaced. And
So what is it? So do you think it's purity? It's the purity of it. You think that's what the wasps sort of want? Like they want a clearly defined, no mixing, just is that utopia?
well, I think that the purity sort of gets
Mm.
redefined
Mhm.
because they invent whiteness as a
Mhm.
way to actually dilute that purity for
Mm,
survival, right? They're
mm,
realizing we're never going to survive as just Anglo-Saxon
mhm,
white
mhm,
Protestants. We have to mix with Irish and
mm.
Italians
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
and kind
Okay.
of Jews to a lesser
Yeah.
extent
Yeah.
to regain the majority. And then all of a sudden you shift from having this very
True.
small Anglo-Saxon population to being once again a very dominant majority of the
True.
country. And
And not only that, but you begin hostile sort of like against, Japanese internment, you have, Chinese exclusion, you have Jim
yes,
Crow, right?
yes, all the same things.
And yeah, and sort of keep, circling the wagons, if you will,
Absolutely. And so the thing that sucks about being white is that the cost that they had to pay, the price they had to pay to hold on to the power of the country is they had to erase all of their basically racial heritage, right? They
Mm,
had to eliminate their ethnic pride,
right.
which is why
Yeah.
you don't go up and talk to white people these days and ask them like, "Oh, like where are
Yeah.
you from?"
Yeah.
Right? They're like,
No,
"I'm from here." And
they'll
like,
tell
"What's
you.
your ethnicity?" They're like, they don't go,
Mm,
"Oh, I'm German and I'm Italian." Like
yeah.
a lot of them are just like, "I don't know, I'm white."
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
like everything.
I think recently though they have started because African Americans, Latino Americans, because
Hmm.
there's an importance, Asian Americans,
Hmm.
there's an importance are where we came from. I think a lot of white people are now starting. That's why the 23andMe is so important
Yes.
because now they're sort of reaching for meaning. They're sort of reaching for a past. But
Yeah.
you're right. For a long time, it was generic white. You know.
Yes.
Um,
And I think
eh, okay, what do you think of this idea? And this is, and I honestly don't know what your answer is going to be, or I don't even know what mine's going
okay.
to be. But this idea of white, especially at like PTA meetings, right, of white
Hmm.
parents saying, "My history teacher is making my white child feel ashamed about being
Hmm.
white while learning U.S. history," right?
Yeah.
And this is idea of, you know,
This is where like critical race theory comes
well, I
in.
didn't want to say critical race theory because they don't understand what that is. But look at me being a
Yeah.
West
It's
Coast elite.
spoiler
But
alert, it's just
yeah,
history. It's
yeah,
just
it's just
American
legal.
history.
It's just legal history. That's all. I actually did take CRT because I went to good law school. But literally, nobody wants to teach your high
Yeah.
school junior that.
Hmm. But so at the PTA
But yeah,
meetings,
but this idea of like I want to feel proud to be white
right.
or an
Right.
American, as
Hmm.
opposed to, oh, America and white people have done some pretty
Hmm.
gnarly tribal, you know,
Hmm.
things. And was that the wrong approach? Right? Did that in fact, create division along racial lines? Or should we
Hmm.
have gone with we're all American? Or yeah, like the line, right? Like how do we and what are the repercussions of teaching kids that, right? Do we, you know,
Hmm.
we got our factual sort of, liberal curriculum, but we get Donald Trump at the end of that.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So what's the
I
trade-off?
heard a study quoted like a late night show once that said that the only demographic that hates themselves more than they find themselves positive are white liberals.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's a pretty
yeah,
unfortunate consequence of this thing.
yes.
Now, I'm not going to say that it is not worth teaching our children history. It
Mm,
is absolutely critical that we
yeah.
teach them exactly everything about slavery and how it
Mhm.
works and whatnot.
I mean,
I do think that
German schools teach the Holocaust.
absolutely, and
Yeah,
it's super like you have to. It's
right,
necessary, or else you're
right,
going to repeat it.
right.
I do think there is a needle that you have to thread that says if I'm white, I can either feel ashamed of being white or be proud of being white.
Or just
And
double down and deny.
right, right. You have to either sit with the guilt and shame and you're just stuck with that because of things that are totally outside of your control, or you have to decide, no, I don't care, now I'm just proud of being white, which like isn't a real ethnicity, and so that goes in the other direction.
Right.
And I think it's very difficult. I don't think that it's an easy thing.
Or you can go the route that Latin American countries have gone,
Mm,
because at one point Mexico tipped over from being exclusively ruled by Spanish people to everyone is marrying each other, and now there's this one new ethnicity, Mexicans, right? And there's a sort of national unity, sort of, this the semblance that there is no white. I mean, there's still prejudice and colorism, sure, in
yeah.
Mexico, right? But it doesn't exist in the same way as it does here. I know
Hmm.
that. I mean, colorism exists in like South America and Brazil. Of course, of
Of
course.
course.
But the one thing that critical race theory did teach me is that racism is uniquely American in that we're the only country that put in our founding documents our racial views. No other country did they put that into their constitution.
Hmm.
That we as a country have this idea about humanity, that one race is literally more of a person than another one, right?
Hmm.
And that is the thesis of CRT, right? The fact that based on that was at the foundation of America, and yes, they created whiteness at the same time that they were creating the Three-Fifths Compromise, and that they're sort of, putting into law prejudice. They're also creating this other concept of there's this other race that now
Hmm.
exists, And you're right. There was a way to expand who got to be in that ruling class, right? And it got bigger and bigger and bigger, right? It used to be men that owned land, and now it was all men, and then it was white men and women, and it got bigger and bigger until 2008, where the minorities all got together
Hmm.
and they became the majority, right? And it terrified white America,
Yeah.
because for the first time, yeah, that founding sort of principle. And look, I am saying that America is and was founded to be a racist place. I mean, the founders were not West Coast liberals. They
Yeah.
they were even in the North, like they
Oh
still
yeah,
thought that
definitely.
white men were superior, right? And yes, we have been wrestling with that error in logic, with that understandable error in logic, right?
Hmm.
I think we are biologically programmed to look out for people that look like us, right? And yet, at the same time, America calls for, you know, pluralism, right? Like,
Hmm.
to out of many, one, right? It also calls for unity. So it is a paradox, you know. And the history of America is a story of how that paradox has played out over the years. And
Hmm.
right now, currently, right, we're at a reckoning, right? And I don't know, if I was white today, I'd be kind of embarrassed. I don't like, this
And
was the
that's
stand that they took,
yeah.
and my God, was it the wrong one, you
Yeah.
know, and it was the wrong person.
And that is an unfortunate consequence of, I think, our inability to thread that needle. And to answer your
Mhm.
question about how do we balance
Mhm.
history with pride and self-esteem, I think that what we have to do is create a permission structure for people to both recognize their history, but also be proud of their heritage, right? I think that that combines devaluing whiteness, the kind of vague whiteness as just based upon color of your skin, and like basing it more around like actual heritage, right? Where, you know, being your German heritage or your Irish heritage or whatever it is, your multi ethnic heritage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those things have histories, right?
Mm-hmm.
That aren't just when you're so fixated on the history of whiteness, you're fixated on a history that is basically built on being anti-black, right? Of like not being black. Like, what is the point of being white other than being not black? That's the only real unifying factor around it. But when you talk about like actual history and these various different countries and heritage, then it's a little bit more, I think you can get beyond that level of pride. You can celebrate St. Patrick's Day or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, Oktoberfest or whatever. And people are like, fine, yeah, that's great. I went to an Oktoberfest. I've been to, you know, I've had great St.
Yeah.
Patrick's Days. I
Yeah.
never felt like it was a white supremacist rally.
So there's this whole bit of, the Germans have a drinking day, Mexican people have a drinking day, Irish people have a drinking day. Why is there no black people drinking?
Well, that's what we gotta aspire for Juneteenth, I guess.
That's right. That has to
That's
be.
why we had to pass
That's right.
Juneteenth, you
That's
know.
right. That's right. Do we even have Juneteenth anymore? I guess we'll find
I,
out.
I don't. Yeah, I guess we'll find out.
It's 2 months
Does it still
away. We'll
exist?
see what happens.
I'm doubtful. I'm doubtful.
Are we still free?
Yeah, and I think we need to tell some stories in media
Yeah.
about white allies that are not like lame and pathetic, right? Like, you know, there's so much in media these days where, and this
Yeah.
is in some part earned, right? Because for many years,
Yeah.
it was just like, you're the white guy, so you're the hero, right? You're watching like Harry Potter or like Percy
Right.
Jackson,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you're like, what's special about this white
Right.
kid? It's like, I don't
Hmm.
know. He's just the special
He's a
white kid.
he's a handsome white kid. Obviously.
Yeah.
Obviously. He's
And
noble. Yes.
you have your Tom Cruises and your Brad Pitts and like
Yeah.
every hero when I was growing up,
Right. Yeah.
Superman, Batman, they're white guys, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And now we're kind of have like a racial reckoning where, you know, we looked at Obama and we were like, there's no reason that the hero has to always be this white guy. Like, let's get some black women in there and some, you know, Asian Americans, and like
Right.
try to mix it up. And like we
And
can,
it bothered white people to no end.
it bothered them a lot, and it actually bothers me too. And I'm getting like full disclosure, it bothers me too because it puts me in awkward positions
Yeah.
where I'm
I know.
like trying to defend like
It
characters
it
that I don't care
it
about.
bothers me too, and this idea of like theater kids and art kids got together and like, now we have Coco and like now you should be seeing immigrant community,
Yeah,
like here you go, you got one, and it's like that's great, but Trump was still elected 4 years later, and I
right.
would much, I mean, there is something to be said about representation media, and I'm trying to be flippant
Absolutely,
about this,
absolutely.
but
And that's not what I'm discounting.
it is definitely not the end all be all of society. Like this is not how
Yeah,
we write society ills, and Hollywood is so happy to sort of pat itself on the back and say,
right. I mean, I don't
look,
know if you
it's
had this
black
like
now,
I don't
you
know if you
know.
had this like conversation, any conversation around like the new Snow White, which I haven't seen yet,
Oh
so I
yeah, yeah,
can't
yeah,
even
yeah. Well,
comment.
I just brought up that the new that the Little Mermaid was black. So,
Yeah,
but yeah,
yeah. Little
yeah, yeah.
Mermaid's black, and
Snow
Snow
White
White
is
is
yeah, is Latina,
Latina,
I guess.
and
Yeah,
I'm like, well, there's no reason that she couldn't. Snow White is her name. It's not necessarily her designated color, but at the same time, if there was a character that I would have assumed would still be Caucasian in
right.
2025, I probably would have picked
Yeah.
Snow White
No, but
amongst
they
the
can't.
top ones,
Yeah, but
right?
they can't do that, right? Disney can't. They have already aligned themselves in the camp of, and you see that I don't find. I mean, they act as if like, oh, MLK's dream has been realized. Now
Yeah,
that Snow
and
White is, it's like, no, there's still poverty. we're still getting deported every other day.
Yeah,
Like
like for me, Zootopia was like
yeah,
more empowering than Snow White. Like if I'm being like totally honest, I'm like,
yes, that is the
yeah,
hill we're gonna die on.
Zootopia was
Yes.
great. Like give me more
Oh, it
like that.
was. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but
You're right.
but yeah, you have like Snow White, and then you have like obviously the online guys who are like angry, and because of this shame and guilt, they're very angry, and they feel like they're being
Mm,
erased. The replacement is happening before their
mm,
eyes. Like white
mm.
people are being turned brown right in front of their eyes. Their childhoods are being changed, right?
Right.
And
And it's done while they're trying to escape. It's done in their entertainment. It's done.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
not, yeah, this is not just like, some CEO of Apple
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like right in front of their face. And
Right.
I think I
Great. Look,
don't
I just realized
believe
that
that it's
you and I just panned the new Snow White because it wasn't the realization of Alma K's dream. And on the other hand, white people were like, no, it melts them down.
right.
And it's like,
And it
great,
might be a great movie.
great.
I haven't seen it.
I
I
haven't
I
seen it
can't
either.
comment on whether it's a
I
good
don't
movie or
think it
not.
is, but whatever.
But my point is that I now find myself defending Snow White on this racial grounds when really I don't want
Yeah.
to. Like this is
Yeah.
not
No,
what
I
I want to
totally
be
get.
spending
Yeah.
my time.
Yeah.
I I can sit here and talk about how there's all this racial animus against
Yeah.
Snow White just because they changed the color of her skin and her ethnicity, and
Yeah.
but that's not
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
that important of a discussion
No, but
in the grand scheme of things.
it seems like talking about that is a little bit more hopeful, and you feel like you have a little bit more agency
Hmm.
on a casting choice, I guess. And the arts have always sort of been a little bit more progressive anyway,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so it makes sense that liberals would sort of retreat into the arts for the
Hmm.
next four
Hmm.
years, where
Yeah, totally.
nothing matters, not. And so, but look at us.
Yeah,
Here we are.
totally.
Yeah.
So I think to me, I understand. I feel like I understand somewhat, and later on we'll get an actual qualified white person to join this
Oh,
conversation, so they can
100%. Yeah.
they can correct the record
Yeah.
and represent an entire
Totally.
race of people. But I
Yeah.
feel like from my
Honestly,
perspective as sort of an
they've had their
outsider,
time. Yeah.
trying to be as empathetic as possible,
They
I
were super
understand
empathetic.
why this grievance exists. I'm not saying that's
Sure.
right. It's
Sure.
rooted in
It's
racism and white
it's very knee
supremacy,
jerk. Very knee
but
jerk.
I understand the emotional, I think, weight of what is happening in this country. And I think that if you don't appreciate that emotional weight, you don't know how to address it. And
Well,
I
yeah.
think
Well,
it's gone totally unaddressed for so
yeah,
long.
let's spend the last couple of minutes on that, right? Like, all right, so we've identified that there's this anxious, wounded,
Hmm.
um, reactionary, group of society that, for some reason or another, feels threatened to an existential level, right? Like replacement is existential, right? Like that
Hmm.
is
Yeah.
some, mother child sort of thing. And so if they consider the threat that big, they are going to fight in if that's where they're at, they're going to fight, appropriately, reacting how they think is appropriate. And how they thought it was appropriate was electing Donald Trump. So now that he's in power again, is there a way to is there a way to address the paradox so that we get another Bill Clinton or we get another Biden as
Hmm.
opposed to
Hmm.
another either JD Vance or Trump himself again, what is going to assuage, or what do we appease white people?
Hmm.
Do we yeah,
And I think
yeah.
that's a
Where do we
real.
go from here?
You brought
Right.
up, I think, some really good examples, and I think both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were elected because they did a masterful job of uniting a coalition of people of color with white people to get elected. And
Yeah.
they were able to give people a permission structure for how to be an ally that
Mm.
didn't feel
Mm.
steeped in shame, like reparations.
Mm.
Obama talked so much about his like white grandfather
Oh
in
yeah.
Patton's
Yeah.
army that
Kansas. He
fought
mentioned
for
Kansas
this
every other.
country and
Yeah.
helped raise him, right? He talked about his white mother. And to them, white America could see themselves in his life as allies and supporters. And I think that both you and I, given our upbringings, have known tons of white people that have helped us along the way. It's not like I go around and white people are all out to get me. That is not how I feel on a daily basis. For some people, that is an
Oh,
experience.
we didn't even talk about people accusing us of being white, Julian.
Well, that's
Yeah,
a topic for another
that is
day.
another topic. Yeah, that's true. But yeah, no, you're right. You're right. And I mean, I also met people, that completely distrust all white people, people of
Mhm.
color.
Yeah.
And again, understandable, right?
Hmm.
Just like, white Americans have this view of all the minorities sort of surrounding them.
Hmm.
Minorities have very understandable, hostility.
Hmm.
White people have been hostile to our community in the past and continue to be hostile. Not all
Hmm.
white people, right? But nowadays, enough to push the needle,
Hmm.
right? And so I do think that there has to be a reconciliation of sorts, right? Minorities and white people are not at odds. We're both Americans, right? And I think we need to focus on what makes us American because I'm going to go way back to where we started.
Hmm.
I no longer see a white person walking down the street and I no longer think to myself, oh, that's an American person. No,
Yeah.
because you're an American person, right? I'm an
Hmm.
American person. And now we have a lot of people, including non-white people, that have an idea of what it is to be an American and they want to push and they want to make it more restrictive, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And but I do believe that there are enough white people in this country that hold a more expansive view of what can be in America,
Yeah,
right?
I
I do
agree.
think that. Yeah.
And I think that we have to, much like our conversation last time about young men, you have to be able to see these people and not immediately assume the worst.
Yeah.
And see, you have to be able to articulate them ways that they can be a hero of their own story and
Yeah.
your story, right?
Right. Right.
And I think it means that you have to acknowledge their concerns and not immediately feel that, like, I've talked a lot about how there's white people are driven by racial animus in their support for Trump,
Yeah.
but I don't think that they want that to be their story, right?
Right.
I want to
Yeah.
believe that you can say that, like, okay, yeah, I see where you're coming from. And yeah, that might be a little racist, but here's how what you really should be after is, billionaires
Yeah.
and getting more
Yeah.
taxes out of them to pay for your education rather than blaming immigrants,
Right.
right? And that does take education. It does take, sometimes hard conversations, but it does take, not assuming we have to not assume that these people are just lost
Right.
and that they're these KKK Neanderthals from like centuries
Mm.
past. Like, this country has
Mm.
made progress.
Right.
They've
That's
been,
true.
just like Trump figured out a way to redirect their anger at the other being immigrants and DEI and
Mm.
whatever. We too can figure out ways to constructively redirect their
Yeah.
angst against actual problems like
Right.
billion
Right.
and a tax system that is just so inequitable,
Right.
and really racism itself, because as I mentioned, with the filling up of the swimming pools,
Mm-hmm.
right? Racism hurts white people
Right.
as well
Right.
as people of
Right.
color. And we're
Exactly.
seeing that now with Trump's policies around immigration and tariffs. It's like,
And
oh,
tariffs.
well,
Yeah.
we're deporting all of the low
Right.
income undocumented
Right.
people and we're putting tariffs,
Mm-hmm.
the rest of the world that are stealing our jobs.
Right.
Oh, wait, what's happening? Our prices are going up. Oh,
Right.
that's not supposed to happen. I thought they were the enemy. It's like, well, sorry, but it turns out that immigrants were responsible for your cheap goods. It turns
Right.
out that those people working overseas
Mm-hmm.
stealing factory jobs are responsible for your cheap clothes. And if you can actually explain that, a world in which we just, you know, get along a little bit better is better for everybody financially, spiritually, whatever.
Or just realize that all Americans, black, white, Latinos, Asians, we're all sort of economic colonializers of the world.
Yeah.
We're all sort of rotten. Um, and maybe work on dismantling, yeah, like you said, those systems of inequality
Hmm.
that are becoming very, very obvious right now. And I'm very, very curious to see how this whole tariff business is going to pan out. Um,
Yeah.
because there's only so much stress you can put on the global economy
Yeah.
before it starts to crack. And then we're going to be in a very interesting spot of all Americans sort of being in the crock pot of crap, right? That Trump has created. And
Mm.
then let's see what happens. And I unfortunately think it's going to go, we're going to coalesce around racial lines again, right? But maybe not.
Well, we'll see.
Maybe there's an opportunity for us to not do that,
You know,
and
if there was
turn
one,
the anger towards the causer, right, of this. Of Yeah.
totally, I think one interesting ray of hope, if you could call it
Mhm.
that I thought was interesting coming out of Trump's election is that when we did see a shift in Latino men like voting for Trump, it made me realize that, oh, it seems like the Republicans are letting more people into the tent again. Whiteness is once again expanding to encompass more ethnicities and cultures. And
Yeah.
it's a double edged
Mm.
sword, but
Mm.
in a sense, it means that you kind of have already what you're worried about is this country being taken over by this monolithic ethnic group.
Yeah.
Well, that monolithic ethnic group is actually made up of like all different types of people, like a
Right.
lot of
And
different types
some
of
of them
people.
agree with you, actually. Yeah.
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 So I don't know.
Unfortunately.
That's one. Even I guess even at the worst, we're seeing America diversify
Hmm.
and people
Hmm.
manage to vote not just along racial lines.
Hmm. Hmm. That's true. I mean, it was surprising and it was disappointing, but you're right. And I believe we already addressed it here. There is something very alluring, about, like I said, when I was a kid, you want to be led into the clubhouse,
Hmm.
you know, and if that means voting for the bully, then we'll do it, and yeah. But, you know, I do think that it's going to come down to who is the next standard bearer,
Yeah.
who is the next person. And I think they're going to have a little bit easier time because they're not going to go up against Trump, or at least in the foreseeable future. It doesn't seem like that way. But yeah, it is up to you. The ball is in your court again, white people. In what is it? This is midterms are this year or next year?
Next year.
Next year. Yeah. We saw a majority white state. I think Wisconsin's a majority white state.
Hmm. Yeah.
Overwhelmingly vote for a liberal for the state Supreme Court, even though there was tons of money, right? And so, yeah, maybe white people are waking up from this
Hmm.
anxiety stupor that they were in. and now they're anxious about their own, their own economics.
Yeah, their own pocketbook,
And racism maybe takes
a backseat to your pocketbook.
yeah,
And if
yeah,
we've reached that part of
maybe.
like that's progress.
I think
That's actually
so.
because that's not always been the case.
I think
Like
so.
let's be real. Historically,
Yeah,
people have been just totally fine with eating
yeah.
economic loss to get rid of the other.
They've been more than comfortable filling up the pool with concrete.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So
let's not do that. Let's not do that next time, America. Let's all swim in the pool of economic distress together.
well, I think we can leave it there.
Yeah.
That's our show. Thanks for watching
Thank
Elephant.
you very much.
Once
Yes.
again, I think
Comments are always welcome.
leave comments, like and subscribe. Anthony, it's been a pleasure.
Oh, yes.
Peace, my
Of
friend.
course. Yeah, you too. Bye bye.